Welcome. If I can get you to come in and take your seats, and we'll begin our program. My name is Rick Mars. It's my pleasure. I'm the Dean of Seaver College to invite you or welcome you to the Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series. In fact, this is the inaugural, the first W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series. Ironically, the person that we named this after last year and made such a big to-do is not here this evening. So there's only one thing that would keep him from being here. He is in another location, and those who know David know where he is. He's in Oklahoma. So he will be back for the rest of the series, but we'll miss him this evening. He's doing research there. It's my pleasure, again, to welcome you and to let you know the format for this evening, and then also to introduce the person who will introduce our speaker this evening. The format will be our speaker this evening will present for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then after that we will have ample time for question and answer. And we're sure that it will generate lots of interest, lots of discussion, and so we have microphones, but we have a couple of people who will actually man the microphones, and if you will, you can stay where you are and they will bring the microphone to you. We'd ask that you stand, but also wait until the microphone comes to you because we're recording this and we want to get your question in the recording. Otherwise, when this goes on iTunes or when this is put out there for others to hear who could not be here tonight, it sounds a little strange if they can't hear the question. So please let the microphone come to you. At the very end, then I will come up and make some concluding remarks. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce the person who will be introducing our speaker tonight. Professor Rodney Honeycutt has come to us in the last couple of years. He spent years as a biologist at Texas A&M. I also almost said the University of Texas where I had been. That would have been anathema, right? At Texas A&M, he's a world-renowned geneticist and population biologist. And so a couple of years ago, we lured him away from Texas A&M, and their loss has been our gain. And so would you please welcome Professor Honeycutt to the lectern so he can introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Rick. My wife and I actually are graduates from the University of Texas, so we have mixed emotions sometimes. What good men most biologists are. The tenors of the scientific world. Temperamental, moody, loud laughing, and healthy. The true biologist deals with life, with teeming, boisterous life, and learns something from it. Learns that the first rule of life is living. Sometimes he may proliferate a little too much in all directions, but he is easy to kill as any other organism. And meanwhile, he is very good company. Like Steinbeck's experience in his book entitled The Log of the Sierra Cortez, our speaker tonight, Jonathan Wiener, has spent his life writing about men and women of science and their commitment to discovery. His writings span the gap between science and non-science, and they expose the human side to scientific investigation, while at the same time drawing the reader into the excitement associated with the enterprise of science. Jonathan's success as a writer is obvious from his many contributions. He has written articles in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, and several other newspapers and magazines. His books have received many accolades, including National Book Critics Circle Award for Time, Love, and Memory, and the 1995 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for his book entitled The Beak of the Finch, which you'll talk about tonight. And currently, Jonathan teaches science writing at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Tonight it is my great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Wiener as the first speaker of the W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series. Thank you, and here's Jonathan.
Many thanks. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Dean Marr, and thanks very much to Rodney and to your wife Dee for your hospitality. This is my first time here at Pepperdine, and I've really enjoyed my visit very much. And I see this watch you lent me is going to slide right down off. No? Okay, it stopped. And thanks also to Dean David Baird, who had invited me last year. I know that the poster for this talk tonight said that I was a biologist myself. I'm not. I'm a writer, as some of you know, who I had the pleasure to meet earlier today. My father was a scientist, my mother was a librarian, and they taught me to love both science and literature. And writing about science has been my way of bringing these two loves together. For a long time, I thought that anybody who had an interest in science and in the arts would have to choose between them. And I did make that choice within about 2 seconds of arriving in college. I went there thinking maybe biology, maybe writing, and spent my years there trying to write poetry. This was Harvard in the 1970s. Robert Lowell was there, the great poet Elizabeth Bishop was there, and Elizabeth Bishop once paid me the highest compliment that my student poetry really deserved. And she said to me, you know, in every one of these poems, there is one beautiful line. I was so grateful, even though I had no idea which line she meant. So after I graduated, I spent a hungry year freelancing for the Christian Science Monitor, the Boston Globe, and many other newspapers and magazines. And then finally happened to write a little essay about one of my pet loves in biology, which is a strange organism called the social amoeba. I had read about the social amoeba in the writing of John Tyler Bonner, a wonderful biologist at Princeton. When I was in high school, I wrote this essay. It was published in Harvard Magazine under the title Marching Along with the Social Amoeba. And it was as if I had found my way writing that little essay, that you could start from almost anywhere. The most obscure, out-of-the-way topic. The social amoeba is really obscure. It's also known as the slime mold and Dictyostelium discoideum. If you're a biologist in a certain line, you've heard of it. Otherwise, I'm sure no one here has heard of it. And yet, there's everything there. You can see everything. It's a microcosm of all of life in that one organism. A triumphant story. Actually, don't get me started. I'm almost getting off onto the social amoeba again. So I thought that's what I want to do. And I've been marching along with that social amoeba ever since. And I want to talk tonight about one of the best stories that I ever came across in that pursuit, which is appropriate to talk about. It's a good occasion right now because in 2009, The Origin of Species will be 150 years old. On February 12th of 2009, Charles Darwin's birthday, as you may have heard, his 200th birthday. And 35 years ago this year, in 1973, two biologists, a husband and a wife team, began a project in Darwin's Islands, the Galapagos Islands, that illuminates Darwin's process and illuminates life on Earth, as well as anything ever conducted in science. And this is it. This is its last year right now. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago at Princeton, I went to the retirement symposium of this husband and wife team. So I first heard about them over lunch in Princeton with John Tyler Bonner, the social amoeba guy. And I still remember my amazement that what they do is possible to do. Darwin himself always thought, as you may know, that you can't watch evolution in action, that you can't see it happen, that it takes place with geological slowness. It is as gradual, in his view, as the building up and wearing down of mountains. It may metaphorically be said, he writes in The Origin of Species in a famous passage, that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving and adding up all that are good, silently and insensibly working wherever and whenever opportunity offers. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages. So I was astonished to hear that Peter and Rosemary Grant, since 1973, had been going to Darwin's Islands, the Galapagos, camping on this tiny desert island called Daphne Major in the center of the archipelago, and getting to know every finch on Daphne Major, every one of the birds that had helped lead Darwin to his theory. The famous Geospiza fortis was the bird they focused on, the medium-beaked ground finch. But there are a baker's dozen of species of Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. And the range of their toolkit, of their beaks, has made them a spectacularly good icon even of the study of evolution. It's the most famous toolkit in the natural world. From the heavy-duty pliers of Geospiza magnorostris, the big beaked ground finch, which looks like it has a sort of a parrot of a beak, to the needle-nosed pliers of the vampire finches. There are vegetarian finches that eat green leaves, which birds are not really supposed to do. And there are these vampire finches which drink blood, which birds are not really supposed to do. The vampire finches will even drink the blood of their own dead. When they first hatch, these finches all look a lot alike, and they will try anything on the island. They'll peck at anything that looks like grub, including grubs. Eventually, they figure out what they're made for, what they're best at, and what they compete best at. And that's what they settle down to specialize in. Well, the Grants had been watching these birds from year to year. They band them. They know each generation since '73, who their parents are, who their grandparents, great-grandparents, the whole family tree going back to 1973. And John Bonner, the slime mold guy, told me, they were seeing evolution in action, in fantastic detail that Darwin himself would have loved to see because, again, he didn't imagine that it was possible. And Darwin, in his voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle, had had only 5 weeks in the Galapagos Islands. So I thought, when I heard that story, this is it. This is it. This is the story that I'm here to write this story. Up until now, I was just hunting and pecking. This is the story. So I courted the Grants, and it was not an easy courtship because Peter and Rosemary had never been written about at any length at all, other than in the textbooks. They were famous in biology. They were virtually unknown outside biology. And they really liked it that way. They were exceedingly private people, as I came to understand. They had never taken pictures of themselves. They had taken tens of thousands of mugshots of Darwin's finches in profile and full face, but they had not taken pictures of each other doing all of this work and raising 2 little girls on Daphne Major, this desert island. They just were not interested they weren't focused on themselves, and they didn't really relish the thought of a young writer coming along and putting the camera on them. And this is back in 1990 now, and they were just about to go to the islands, and I still remember Peter was nice enough to have lunch with me in Princeton just before he left, and during the lunch he sprang up and paced off this tiny little area. He was talking about his campsite, his and Rosemary's campsite, which is on the rim of this volcano. Their graduate students call it the biggest ashtray in the world. It's the cinder cone of a volcano that floats in the middle of the Pacific. Looks a lot like an ashtray. And he said, this is it. This is the size of our campsite on the rim. There's room for no more. And he had this peculiar glee, and I realized what it must have been, why he was gleeful only afterwards. What he was really saying is it's too small for visitors. So I spent almost 2 years getting to know the Grants' work, getting to know their former students, reading all their papers, hundreds of papers by them and by their students about this study of evolution in action. Before the grants, began to feel that maybe I was serious and that I wasn't going to go away and that they might talk with me. And I think also I started to get genuinely caught up in the day-to-day drama of what they were watching. And I went to visit them on the island. I was fortunate enough to arrive just as they had trapped two of the most wanted evasive finches on Daphne Major. And Peter and Rosemary were extremely excited as they were measuring the beaks of those birds, measuring them every which way down to the hallux or big toe. But even then, Peter said to me when I arrived on the island, "You know, Jonathan," I should have mentioned they have wonderful British accents, Peter and Rosemary. "You know, Jonathan, we're going to be very busy right now, but we could talk to you a little later. Maybe," he said, "if you want to go around to the other rim, the other side of the volcano, there's some interesting World War II relics you could take a look at there." And I said, "Peter, I've come all this way, and it's a fabulously difficult place to reach. You have the water, the Pacific is going up and down, up almost as high as a ceiling, not as high as this ceiling, and down as low as a basement, and your boat is going up and down, and you have to jump from the boat onto this little stony welcome mat at the base of the island and then climb up." I said, I'm here only this short time, I can't come back. May I watch you do this work? And they let me watch, and that became the first scene of the book. Peter and Rosemary on the rim of this volcano measuring those birds. So they themselves didn't think that you'd be able to see evolution in action. And it was only 4 years after they had been studying the birds that a dramatic event took place that told them and their graduate students that in fact they were onto something really extraordinary in this study. There was a drought, a bad drought in 1977 on Daphne and throughout the archipelago. At the start of that year, there were 1,200 Geospiza fortis, the medium-beaked ground finch that I mentioned before, on Daphne. By the end of that year, there were only 180. So 85% of the birds had died in that drought. They hadn't made it because there was so little food for them. And the ones who had made it were the ones who could crack those last tough seeds that nobody else could crack. They were the ones who had been born with the nutcracker that you need to get out to crack those last sealed pistachio nuts at the bottom of the bowl, let's say. And they had that nutcracker beak. Their beaks were a little bit longer, a little deeper, a little bit narrower, and they could crack seeds called tribulus, which means trouble in Latin, that no one else was able to crack. So there was a tremendous episode of natural selection in 1977, and then when the rains finally came, there was an episode of sexual selection equally dramatic, because the males among birds are typically bigger than the females. So it was the males who had the nutcracker beaks that could crack those last tough seeds. Much more of them, 6 times more of them survived than the females. And so the females, once the rains came and the breeding season began, every female had a choice among 6 males. And the ones they picked were the ones that had the hot beak that year, which was that deep and narrow beak that had allowed them to crack the tribulus seeds. And so they passed on the change that had been selected during the drought to the next generation, those surviving couples, and the next generation had a visibly different beak, measurably quite distinct. It had been honed, shaped, and sculpted by natural selection. There was a wet year a few years later. El Nino in 1983 was the biggest Nino in centuries, and the Galapagos sit in sort of the epicenter of El Nino. They were very hard hit. Daphne Major had a torrential year of rains, and suddenly this desert island, this brown cinder cone, this huge ashtray of an island, turned emerald green within a week of those huge rains. Now the island was covered with grasses and with vines, and those tough tribulus seeds were almost nowhere to be found. The birds that had that hot beak back in 73 and 74 were in trouble compared to the birds who were smaller, who had short pointed beaks, relatively small and short compared to the rest of the medium beaks, and they were the ones who survived much more than the tribulus equipment of 73. And they were the ones who passed on their genes. And so the pendulum of natural selection swung the other way. So in their study, since 73, the Grants have seen many episodes, very dramatic episodes like that, of evolution by natural selection, pushing the birds one way, pulling the birds another way. Each population swings and sways. The motion is continuous, the motion is turbulent, and the motion is seemingly like Brownian motion, if you know what happens to atoms when they're buffeted by other atoms in the molecular soup. It is seemingly a random walk, just a random zigzagging walk. What they can see in all of this random jittery energy is that all of the steps that Darwin hypothesized without seeing them are taking place. The natural selection pressure is taking place. It's recognizing differences as slight as 0.5 millimeter in the length of a beak of a finch makes the difference between who lives and who dies year after year. And those differences are passed on to the next generation. And natural selection and sexual selection sometimes act to magnify the effects so that you have visible and dramatic changes from one generation to the next. And if those changes were sustained for, say, 100 years, either the 100-year drought, God forbid, on Daphne, or the 100-year flood, equally difficult for everything living there, most of what's living there. If those changes were sustained that long, you would arrive from the medium beak ground finch at a species that would be clearly comparable to the next species up in that tree of, that little bush of the tree of life, the Galapagos finches. You would have transformed one line of medium beak ground finches into the big beak ground finch. Or if in flood after flood, the birds had evolved the other way, you would have arrived at the small beak ground finch. It's small changes like that adding up year after year in times of enormous sustained crisis that the Grants and evolutionary biologists infer creates new species. When the first of the ancestors of Darwin's finches were blown to those little islands hundreds of miles west of the coast of continental South America. They're off Ecuador. They did arrive in a place that was dramatically different from home. They were exiled from the continent, they were exiled from the rainforests, and only those made it who could survive on those tough desert islands. And generation after generation, they evolved and they specialized and they radiated. The technical term is an adaptive radiation. radiating, say, like a candelabra from the one stem, or like the tree of life from a trunk to all of its branches and twigs, radiating into this baker's dozen of species that we now see in the islands. And enormous, interesting, and difficult problems arise when you try to imagine that moment, the origin of a new species from these little changes. And I imagine many of you are thinking that through right now and trying to imagine how changes involving a millimeter or two in the shapes of the beaks could lead to new species, as Darwin argues. Well, it is a gradual process in the sense that it does take place one step at a time, according to Darwin's theory. And he predicts that what we should see in new species, relatively new species, is that the isolation that has begun to evolve, the almost island effect, the isolation that surrounds a species so that it will mate only with its kind and not mate with other neighbors that are close to them but not exactly like them, that itself should evolve slowly but surely through evolution by natural selection. And you can see that also happening in Darwin's Finches, and that's what Peter and Rosemary have been most fascinated by over these last 10 or 20 years of their extraordinary study. The youngest species on the islands, including this medium-beaked groundfinch, Geospiza fortis, are still such young species that they don't always mate kind with kind. Fortis will occasionally mate with the small-beaked finch or with the big-beaked finch. It happens only maybe one time or two in 100 that a pair will form across those lines of those two young species. But they're still closely enough related that they're interfertile, and they can produce fertile offspring. The oldest species in the family tree of Darwin's finches include the vegetarian finch and the vampire finch. They're pretty different, and a vampire will never mate with a vegetarian, and a vegetarian will never mate with the carnivorous vampire finch. So there, sexual selection, reproductive isolation has evolved to the point that instinctively the male will never choose a female of another species. The female will never mate with a male of another species. But it does still happen once in a while in the most fluky circumstances, and the Grants have watched that also. For instance, I heard about this only at their retirement symposium a few weeks ago. Every once in a while, a baby fortis is born among the big-beaked Geospiza magnerostris. Its parents have laid the egg near the territory of these giant birds, and then maybe the father has died. The baby, as it grows up, hears the songs of the big-beaked ground finch rather than hearing its own father's song, and it imprints on that. So as it comes of age and begins to sing and court, it sings the song of the wrong species. It sings the song of the big-beaked guys when it's a medium-beaked. Well, that's not good if you're a medium-beaked finch, because the big-beaked guys, as soon as they hear the medium-beaked start to sing their song, they mob him, they bully him, they harass him, and he doesn't get anywhere in his courtship. There was only one success story that the Grants have seen, and this is how this bird adapted to his difficult circumstances. First, when he started to sing and all these giant beaked finches around him started mobbing him, he learned his lesson and he got very quiet. And for 7 years, he said virtually nothing, and he didn't try to court or to mate. And then finally, after 7 years, he did pair up, not with a giant, but with another fortis, with a fortis female. And so then he passed on his genes. It's that kind of tension arising in very young species, at the borders between very young species, that eventually produces strong enough instincts to recognize and to mate with your own, that you have an isolated, true species, a good species, as biologists will sometimes say. So even there, you've got to picture something in flux. I mean, when we look around and we see crows, we see ravens, we see coyotes, we think crows, ravens, coyotes. In fact, every generation is slightly different from every other. Every population is slightly different from every other. All of this turbulent evolution by natural selection is going on around us right now. And in very young species, it's almost like two raindrops are beginning to separate as they fall, and they're still joined by a little bridge of water. And they haven't yet split apart, and the two gene pools therefore are still connected by a very slight band. And if the pressures are such, they will break apart and they will become two species. The Grants wrote about that recently in a big review paper in Science, which they titled Fission and Fusion Among Darwin's Finches. And among other things, they speculate, very interestingly, that species are more likely to go extinct after they cease to interbreed, because that little bit of novelty in the genes traveling between them, say between Fortis and Magnorostris or Fortis and the small-beaked groundfinch, provides much-needed novelty that allows these birds to carry on and survive and find innovative ways of making it through disasters like the drought or the flood. So it was really an extraordinary symposium in their honor at Princeton earlier this month. Darwin wrote in The Voyage of the Beagle, "It is the fate of most voyagers no sooner to discover what is most interesting in any locality than they are hurried from it." He was writing ruefully about having spent a mere 5 weeks in the Galapagos Islands. No one's ever going to say that about the Grants after 35 years in the Galapagos. And there were extraordinary stories of the work that's been done building on theirs in recent years, since The Beak of the Finch came out. I was very interested to meet Cliff Tabin, for instance, of Harvard Medical School. He's interested in development, the development of the baby in the womb, and the development, pediatric development, very young children. And he became interested in Darwin's finches and in working with Peter and Rosemary to see if they could figure out what's going on at the level of the genes in response to all this evolution by natural selection, what changes and sculpts those beaks. And they have found two genes that do the work of the sculpting. One of them is called bone morphogenetic protein 4, BMP4. Finches with bigger beaks tend to have more of that. Finches with smaller beaks have less. And they can actually manipulate in the laboratory with chicken embryos, and by adding BMP4 and another protein called calmodulin, they can do the sculpting of the beaks in the lab. And as another token of the unity of the family tree of life, it's the same gene that shapes the beak of the finch in the egg and also shapes the human face in the womb. So Tabin is now working on a different problem, also interesting. Why do cave animals lose their their eyes after generations, immigrants into caves, spiders, fish, famously will go blind. What happens, and is it always the same genes, always the same mechanism, developmental mechanism that produces that evolutionary change? And that's what he's trying to find out. Another person at Princeton, this doesn't build on the grants, but I just thought it was cool. Maybe some of you heard about this past spring. I'd missed the story, but there's a guy at Princeton who's interested in locusts and what happens, why do they swarm, what happens in the swarms. In his view, it's a cannibalism story. Did any of you hear about this? He thinks every locust in a locust swarm is chasing the one in front of it, trying to eat it, and fleeing from the one behind it, trying not to get eaten. So when we talk about a plague of locusts coming, it's no fun to be a locust either. And my thought is that this may explain what happens to our politicians when they start to swarm. So my favorite among the biologists who spoke at the symposium was a young woman named Hopi Hoekstra of Harvard, who told me that she had read The Beak of the Finch when she was in high school, and reading that, she knew what she wanted to be when she grew up. She wanted to be Rosemary Grant. And she's doing work now at Harvard that's very much in the tradition of the Grant's work. Many biologists around the world are doing work in this tradition. It's unpublished still, what I'm about to tell you, and I don't really have details, and in fact, shouldn't offer details if I had them. But she's crossing different species of mice in the laboratory that are, again, young enough species that you can make these crosses. They won't mate with each other, but if you take sperm from one, eggs from the other, and do in vitro fertilization, you can produce hybrids. I think I have this right, that she has to do it that way. But one species makes a burrow with a very long tunnel down into the earth, one species of mouse, and it has a long, equally long escape tunnel going back up like a V. And another species makes a shorter burrow and maybe no escape tunnel at all, I'm not sure. She crosses them, and then she's built these huge, like, visible tunnels like ant farms in her laboratory at Harvard, and she sees what do they do, how do they dig their tunnels. And it's extraordinary how, first of all, how powerful these instincts are. And mice that have been raised as laboratory mice for 30 generations, they've never seen dirt. When she puts them in one of these mouse farm setups that she has with all that dirt, they immediately go to work digging, and they dig tunnels just like their ancestors of 30 generations before. When she produces hybrids, she gets all kinds of variations on the theme of the deep tunnel and the escape tunnel. And what she's now going to do is look at the genes and try to figure out just where it is written in the DNA, written in the genes, that if you're, I don't know, a California mouse or an Oldfield mouse, or a deer mouse, I forget the species that she's using, you have to dig the tunnel this way. And if you're this other species, you have to dig it this way. And with the extraordinary explosion in studies of gene sequences, of genomics now, more and more of that kind of work is being done. We were talking earlier today about looking at the instincts of dogs, for instance, and why do retrievers retrieve? Why are labs such good swimmers? Why are newfies so compelled, if they see someone thrashing in the water, to go swimming out and try to rescue them? Why are border collies such good herders? All of those are in the genes somehow. They're instinctive, and it's going to be possible to study those, the evolution of those instincts, just as the Grants can study the more mundane, visible beaks of the finches and how they're shaped by evolution, by natural selection, and how they've evolved through time. So I love that mouse that immediately goes to work digging after 30 generations without having touched the earth. It seems to me there's a lesson there. If you haven't found a calling like that yet, keep digging. Keep looking for that. I've often said that when I first heard about the Grants and their work, I knew so little about evolution that I didn't even know it was controversial. I soon found out, in fact, that it is highly controversial, and I just want to talk a little bit about that because it's a matter that I find very sad and also very close to home. My wife was a religious studies major in college. By the time we met, she was just a minute or so out of college. I was already writing about the social amoeba. I was a science writer, and we used to have wonderful, friendly, but serious arguments about science and religion all the time. And it became my project, in a way, to talk about stories like this and to try to show the beauty and the miracle of biology to people who were not in the tent, and to bring them into the tent to appreciate the beauty of what is there to be seen. Debbie and I had so many discussions about things like this that when a New Yorker cartoon came out in the middle of our courtship showing a guy saying goodbye to a girl at her door, clearly a first date, Debbie showed me this cartoon. She's saying to him, "Good night, Roger. I'll always treasure what you told me tonight about photovoltaic cells." So I would show Debbie my manuscripts, and she would, if she felt I'd lost my way, if it was too technical or too dry, she would write in the margin, "This made me want to cry." Or she would write, sometimes worse yet, she would write, "Good night, Roger," And so then I would go back and I would try to explain it again in a way that would draw her in. And writing about the Grants and about Darwin's Finches, we used to have those kinds of conversations again, almost day after day. And she would say, "Do you really mean to say that from that you get this whole magnificent tree of life?" And so we would talk about it, and I would try to explain the sequence. I must say, to really appreciate the intricacy of the story, you have to read the book. But I would try, and I would also read the Bible every morning, as I still do very often. I would remind myself that there is more than one way of looking at the world and looking at the experience of life than the view from Darwin's Islands. And I would try to write in such a way that could include as many dimensions of the mystery around us as possible. And at one point I told Debbie, my wife, that Charles Darwin's wife, Emma, was a devout Christian, and that she was terrified that they would be separated in eternity because she would go to heaven and he would go to hell. So that is a dramatic story. When Debbie heard that, she's a writer, she's a children's book writer, she decided to write a book about the love story of Charles and Emma. And it really is an extraordinary story, and I read it. It's not in print yet. This is just an advanced copy that the publisher gave Debbie, and I read on the plane here. It's called Charles and Emma, The Darwin's Leap of Faith. And it's, I think, a remarkable story of the way two people managed to, in spite of the sense almost that they were sleeping with the enemy, each of them, managed to see their way to a wonderful union and a wonderful marriage and a very fruitful and happy life together. And not by each closing one eye, but by each talking ardently and fervently and trying to understand the other almost day after day. So I just want to close by reading you just a little bit about the love story of Charles and Emma. It also reminds me a little of Peter and Rosemary. Not that they had the barrier that Charles and Emma had to overcome, but another extremely happy, long, and wonderful love story of a marriage that's inspiring. You know, they would wake up in the middle of the night on this desert island. One of them would have an idea and wake the other and say, do you think this could be going on? Do you think that could be going on? And they wrote their papers together. They raised these little girls together on Daphne. It's a beautiful family story, although sadly hardly at all documented in snapshots or slides or home movies. Nicola, their older daughter, told me at the retirement dinner that Rosemary said not long ago she'd found a home movie that showed the two girls as little girls. And they were very excited to see it, and they sat down to watch it. And it showed them collecting, I think it was collecting fish from the welcome mat at Daphne Major and putting them into a bucket and looking at them. There was maybe 30 seconds of the little girls collecting the fish, and then the rest of the whole movie was watching the fish in the bowl swimming around. So Emma wrote to Charles when they were first courting, "My reason tells me that honest and conscientious doubts cannot be a sin, but I feel it would be a painful void between us." "When I am with you," she wrote, "I think all melancholy thoughts keep out of my head, but since you are gone, some sad ones have forced themselves in, of fear that our opinions on the most important subject should differ so widely." They decided to get married anyway. It's a beautiful and touching story. And she wrote him a letter. Even though now they were living together, it meant so much to her. She wrote the letter saying, "Everything that concerns you concerns me, and I should be most unhappy if I thought we did not belong to each other forever." Again, worrying that one would go to heaven and the other would go to hell. And Darwin, tremendously moved by that letter, "Everything that concerns you concerns me," he kept the letter safely preserved always, and sometime later he wrote at the edge of it, "When I am dead, know that many times I have kissed and cried over this. CD." So I can't resist reading you just one or two more. She read The Origin of Species for him, and she wrote in the margins things like "not clear" or "a great assumption," E.D., Emma Darwin. 2 pages later, another bold saying. And Debbie shows how much Emma's doubts and skepticism informed Darwin and helped to shape the writing of The Origin of Species and to refine and improve the book and his theory, in spite of the fact that Emma was really not a scientist and was really not that interested. Charles once told a story, he actually more than once, he loved this, of taking Emma to a scientific meeting and at one point whispering to her, I am afraid this is very wearisome for you." And she whispered back very politely, "No more than all the rest." So I didn't know until I read this book that there was a tangled bank near their house that Charles and Emma often saw on their walks from Down House, their home in the country. And if you read the last passage, the last lines of The Origin of Species, he talks about that tangled bank. It's one of the most famous passages in all of science. Charles and Emma were entangled in their love and in science, just as mind, heart, and spirit are entangled in each one of us. And it's for the sense of mystery and of a sense that there's more than we can ever take in our mortal lives, no matter how much we try through any avenue, that I chose as the epigraph for the Beak of the Finch these lines from the book of Job. And where is the place of understanding? It is hid from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Thank you very much. Questions of any kind are welcome.
My question is, how exactly did Peter and Rosemary find this research topic, and how did they become really interested in this?
That's a good question. They were studying birds in Turkey before this, among other things, and they were really frustrated because when you study most birds in the wild, you have trouble getting close. And Peter once spent, I think it was a whole afternoon, he had put out some pistachio nuts again as bait for one of these birds, and he sat in a blind and waited and waited and waited, and none of the birds he was interested in ever came. And he wrote tersely in his notebook, it would have been better to use caged birds. Well, what they found in the Galapagos essentially is wild birds that are also caged. They are caged by their life on this tiny desert island, Daphne Major. And it's only the young and the restless that will ever leave Daphne. And what they often do, the young birds, is they fly out in the direction of the nearest speck of land they can see, Daphne Minor, which is like a castle that rises from the middle of the Pacific, just on the horizon from Daphne Major. But it is so forbidding that they take one look at it and they fly right back home to Daphne Major. So they live on Daphne, they die on Daphne, and they represent a beautiful living laboratory where the grants can study them year after year. So they were interested in the problems of evolution by natural selection already, and they thought that they would make a study of all the selection pressures, what seeds are available, what seeds aren't available, what's the climate like, and then try to infer what sorts of pressures had sculpted this bonsai, if you like, of this little tree of life that represented by the 13 or so species of Darwin's finches. They didn't realize just how great a study site they had until that drought of '78, when it became possible to watch evolution in action. And then they knew they really had to stay on. So it's a great lesson in the importance of perseverance in studies like this. I mean, 35 years, and they still are finding new things all the time. They make that point in a review article that they just published in Science describing this 35-year-old study. By the way, during that difficult courtship period that I mentioned, when Peter and Rosemary were trying to keep the reporter at a distance, Peter said, we're going to wrap this up in a year or two. This was 1990. He said, and I'm sure you would prefer to not to write about a work in progress. So if I had waited, I would have had to wait until now. And I don't think they're even done now. I think that they'll spend the rest of their lives pouring through all this massive data, beautiful data that they've collected, and looking for patterns and looking for answers there. It's just a great study site. It's one of their students, David Anderson, talks about it the way a young Russian novelist might talk about War and Peace. Nobody will ever find a story like this again. And I have to say, as a writer, I feel that way too sometimes. I'll never find a story like this again. for them to go back to the origin of the origin and see so much. It's extraordinary. Another question?
I know how puzzling it might be to be interested in evolution as well as being a Christian at the same time. So this question might be a little bit more personal. Do you believe that the world was created in 7 days?
Well, I have to say that's outside my area of expertise. When Darwin was asked questions like that, he used to say, to save those questions for the theologians and ask natural history questions of the natural historian. I know fairly well some biologists, evolutionary biologists, who are devout Christians and who've struggled with those sorts of questions and have found their way to a deep, secure feeling in their faith and also in their research. And one of them is just a few seats away from you. Professor Honeycutt is both a devout Christian and a student of evolutionary biology. So I think you should talk with him about it better than with me. Another is, and I'm not brushing you off, it's not something I can talk about with any kind of depth. Another is Ken Miller at Brown University, also a Christian and deeply involved in his faith and also deeply involved in evolutionary biology. And I think Ken Miller, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be speaking here as part of this lecture series later in the year. I can tell you a story about that, though, just briefly. When my computer crashed, just as I was trying to finish the last chapter of The Beak of the Finch, I took it to the Apple repair shop. And it was after hours, and there was still a repairman there, and he very kindly opened up the machine and spread it out over the counter, and started tinkering with it because it was a hardware problem. And I had to meet this Federal Express deadline with my publisher, and it was really a nightmarish moment for me to see the computer spread out over the counter. And after about half an hour, we were chatting, and he said, "Hey, so what's your book about?" And I said, "Evolution." And he just stopped, and he said, "Well, I'm an engineer, and I have to tell you that I have a very different view of creation than the evolutionary view." So we just looked at each other for a minute, and then, with great charity, he went back to putting together the computer. Another question?
Even if Darwin had more time for observations, do you think that he would have had similar results to the Grants, or are some of their observations of more rapid natural selection due to recent climate changes?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a few different points in one, really. First, if he could have made studies like this, would he have seen the kinds of things the Grants are doing? The answer is yes, and he came very close. There's a story that I tell in the book of a terrible winter ice storm at Down House, where he and his family lived, in which many birds were killed, and he asked his butler, his long-suffering butler, Parslow, to go out and collect birds, and then he looked at them to try to understand why some had lived and some hadn't. But because he couldn't imagine that it'd be possible to see evolution in action, he didn't pursue studies like that. In fact, they were well within reach with the tools he had available in the 19th century. Now, with computers and with the ability to look at the DNA of the birds, you can do incredibly more than Charles Darwin would have been able to do back when nobody even knew about genes, the mechanism of inheritance, DNA. So the world that opens up when you try to look is much richer and much more detailed than he could even have begun to approach had he tried. But there was a second part to your question. How did you end the question? I know there was another direction I wanted to address there.
Were there observations of more rapid natural selection due to recent climate changes?
Oh, yes, thanks. The grants think that it may be that incredibly intense Nino year in '83 and a succession of other really bad Nino years that clobbered the islands afterwards might be driven by global warming. And so evolutionary changes that they've been watching there may be the first detailed observations of the effects of global warming on Darwin's Islands. Because, of course, the human success story is a very mixed story for all the other species that we share this planet with. Some of them are very hard hit. Some of them are going extinct. Some of them are struggling along. And all of that is evolution by natural selection. So we are, through climate changes and also through introduced species like the crayfish around here, which another one of your biology professors here is watching, and grimacing as he watches. Those are changes that are induced by the rise of the human species and the rise of the industrial age and our population explosion and our global explosion of, this huge belch of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere every year. And those are creating enormously turbulent and interesting times for all other life forms on the planet, and may begin to be producing what you call, with gritted teeth, interesting times for the human species as well. Another question?
The rate of extinction right now is supposedly much higher than the background extinction rate. Did the finches on Darwin's Island, the Galapagos Islands, show this, or was it just a normal background rate of extinction?
Good question. They were very well protected up until a few centuries ago. They were discovered, the Galapagos Islands, quite belatedly by explorers. And that's why the birds have no fear of you. That's why, in fact, the birds are afraid of their natural predators, Galapagos hawks and Galapagos owls, but not of human beings. So if a hawk flies by while Peter and Rosemary are working, all of these finches around them will fly to Peter and Rosemary and perch on their shoulders the way they would perch on a cactus tree. Once sailors and whalers started to arrive in the islands, then the modern story of life on Earth began in the Galapagos as well. Some of the sailors and whalers released goats on the islands so that if they ever came back or somebody was shipwrecked, there would be food to eat for the sailors. Well, those goats began to eat, knock over the opuntia, the cactus, knock over and eat and browse down to the lava many of the plants in the islands. And there was a giant finch, Geospiza magnorostris, which Darwin was the very first to see as a naturalist in 1835 on that voyage of the Beagle, and which only a few years later had already gone extinct because of the arrival of the goats. And now the animals and plants in the Galapagos, as they are everywhere else, are more and more beleaguered, partly because of the popularity of the Galapagos for ecotourism. And it's one of the painful paradoxes of ecotourism, is that no matter how careful you are, you're liable to bring things along with you that then may cause trouble for pristine environments, once pristine environments like the Galapagos. So even the finches are potentially endangered by all of the introduced species that will be continuing to arrive in spite of our best efforts not to bring them along with us. One little story about that: we were always careful when we were traveling around in the islands not to bring bring any pests inadvertently from one island to another in the archipelago. So we had these big metal sort of trunks full of fruit, which we brought along from campsite to campsite. And one of my jobs as not even chief cook, but just bottle washer, was to take the trunk down to the water's edge and wash off all of that fruit, both before we went from one island to the next and then afterward. Well, on one island, Española, there are vampire finches, and there are also mockingbirds that have evolved the vampire instinct. And I remember how weird and Hitchcocky it was to go down there to the water's edge, and I'm washing off a bunch of bananas while flocks of vampire finches and mockingbirds are landing on me and landing on the bunch of bananas, and I'm trying to shoo them away like flies. And those big, sharp beaks were going into those bananas. It was kind of sobering to watch, knowing that we were there. We were only, they were the only people there within 50 miles, and we were surrounded by these vampires. In fact, there are all sorts of stories about the vampires that I didn't put in the book and that I may never put on paper. But it does take a huge amount of work to keep an environment like the Galapagos pristine, and the efforts of the ecotourism, of the ecotours have been extraordinary in the islands, and I still would encourage people to go. In fact, if I can make a little plug, Professor Rodney Honeycutt and I think a colleague of yours, Ed Larson, who's written a wonderful book about the islands, Evolution's Workshop, which many of you may know, are leading a group to the Galapagos this summer. If you can possibly go, you should go. It really is, in some ways, like wandering around in an alternative Garden of Eden, because, again, all of these animals are completely trusting of you. And the baby sea lions, like young kids, they'll come up and sort of sniff it. My kid Benjamin was 6 the last time I was there, and the baby sea lions would come up to him and sniff at his knees and just want to play, and all these, it's just extraordinary. All these wonderful animals are right around you, friendly and trying to make friends with you, or at the very least not afraid of you and taking shelter when their enemies are around. I mean, you're transported back to a time before there was such a gulf, such a divide between the human species and the rest of our neighbors.
Let's thank Professor Weiner.
Thanks. Okay.
He's been very gracious with his time today. He met with the creative writing class, and then I think he met, as was mentioned, with students. And so we really thank you for being so generous with your time. And so that you don't forget that you've been in another place that a lot of people think is a pretty great place to live. We have a Pepperdine mug for you, and we also have a Pepperdine sweatshirt.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you for coming and spending your evening, and we're dismissed.